The first rays of dawn stretched across the rugged mountains of the Apache reservation, painting the rocky cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. The desert air was cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush and juniper as the wind whispered through the cottonwood trees lining the dry creek bed. It was a place where generations of Apache families had lived, preserving traditions passed down by their ancestors. Every sunrise was a reminder that life moved in cycles, birth and death, joy and sorrow, loss and renewal. For 28-year-old Daniel Yazzie, however, the beauty of that morning meant nothing. He sat alone on the worn wooden steps of his small adobe home, staring into the distance with hollow eyes. In his trembling hands rested a tiny pink blanket that still carried the faint scent of lavender. It had belonged to his wife, Lena, who had lovingly folded it weeks before while dreaming about the child they were expecting. Lena had been the heart of their little home. She laughed easily, sang Apache lullabies while cooking dinner, and believed every hardship could be overcome with patience and faith. Ever since learning she was pregnant, she had spent countless evenings sewing tiny clothes, carving small wooden toys with Daniel, and imagining the future they would build together. Neither of them imagined that future would disappear in a single night. The labor had begun unexpectedly during a violent summer storm. Rain pounded the dusty roads as Daniel rushed Lena toward the nearest hospital, nearly an hour away. Every minute felt endless. Lena tried to smile through the pain, squeezing Daniel's hand as she whispered that everything would be all right. Those were the last comforting words she ever spoke. Complications during childbirth forced the doctors into an emergency they couldn't stop. Despite every effort, Lena suffered severe bleeding. The medical staff fought desperately to save her, but by sunrise, Daniel was holding a healthy newborn daughter in one arm while hearing the words that shattered his world forever. "I'm so sorry. We couldn't save your wife." Everything after that became a blur. Friends offered condolences. Relatives prepared the funeral. Neighbors brought food that Daniel barely touched. The house that had once echoed with laughter now felt painfully silent. Only the cries of his newborn daughter broke the stillness. Daniel named her Maya, the name Lena had chosen months before. She had said it represented strength and hope. Looking into his daughter's tiny face, Daniel wanted desperately to believe those words still held meaning. But hope quickly faded. Maya refused every bottle he offered. The hospital had sent them home with infant formula and careful instructions, but nothing seemed to work. Daniel warmed the bottles exactly as the nurses had shown him. He tried different feeding positions. He gently rocked her while humming songs Lena used to sing. Every attempt ended the same way. Maya turned away. She cried until exhaustion overtook her. Then she drifted into restless sleep without drinking enough to survive. Each passing day made her weaker. Her tiny arms seemed thinner. The bright color in her cheeks faded. Her cries grew softer, until even those heartbreaking sounds became little more than faint whimpers. Daniel barely slept. Night after night he walked the floor holding Maya against his chest, begging her to eat. "Please," he whispered through tears. "Your mama wanted you so much. Please don't leave me too." The loneliness was overwhelming. Every room reminded him of Lena. Her favorite coffee mug still sat beside the sink. Half-finished baby blankets remained folded on the couch. A small rocking chair stood in the nursery, waiting for a mother who would never sit there. Daniel couldn't bear to move any of it. Members of the reservation came by often. Old friends left casseroles on the porch. Church members offered prayers. Tribal elders spoke gentle words about strength, tradition, and healing. Daniel thanked them politely but rarely invited anyone inside. He believed his grief was something he had to carry alone. The visitors could hear Maya crying through the door, but Daniel insisted everything was under control. It wasn't. On the 5th day after returning home, Maya had lost more weight. The local clinic warned Daniel that newborns could become dangerously dehydrated if they continued refusing food. They encouraged him to return immediately if things became worse. He promised he would. Still, every hour he delayed, hoping the next bottle would finally work. Instead, Maya grew weaker. Even the reservation seemed to notice. Neighbors exchanged worried glances whenever Daniel carried the tiny bundle outside for fresh air. The old women sitting beneath the shade trees quietly prayed as he passed. Children stopped playing to watch the exhausted young father walking slowly through the dusty road with his sleeping baby. Everyone wanted to help. No one knew how. Late one evening, Daniel sat beside the window as darkness settled over the mountains. Maya lay motionless in his arms, too tired even to cry. He gently touched her tiny fingers. "They're so small," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Just like your mother's." A wave of fear unlike anything he had ever known swept over him. He had already buried the love of his life. Now he feared he might soon bury their daughter too. Outside, the reservation grew quiet. Porch lights flickered on one by one, casting warm pools of light across the dirt roads. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called into the night, its lonely cry echoing through the desert. Daniel closed his eyes, exhausted beyond words. For the first time since Lena's death, he admitted to himself that he didn't know what to do anymore. He had tried everything he knew. He had prayed. He had pleaded. He had stayed awake until dawn after dawn. Yet the tiny life in his arms continued to fade. As tears rolled silently down his face, a gentle breeze rustled the wind chimes hanging near the front porch. Then, through the stillness of the night, came the sound that would change everything. Someone knocked softly on the front door. The knock came again, soft but steady. Daniel looked toward the front door, confused. It was well past sunset, and very few people visited at that hour. Most neighbors had already stopped by during the week, offering condolences or leaving meals on the porch. He wasn't expecting anyone. Maya stirred weakly in his arms, letting out a faint cry that barely rose above a whisper. Daniel wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt and slowly crossed the room. Every step felt heavy. He unlocked the door and pulled it open. Standing on the porch was an elderly Apache woman wrapped in a dark woven shawl embroidered with traditional patterns. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head, and her weathered face carried the quiet wisdom of someone who had lived through both joy and unimaginable sorrow. It was Martha Begay. She lived 3 houses down, alone in a small home surrounded by flowering desert plants. Everyone on the reservation knew her. She was kind, gentle, and rarely spoke more words than necessary. Children loved visiting her because she always greeted them with homemade fry bread or stories about the old Apache ways. Daniel had seen her many times over the years, but they had never spoken for long. "I'm sorry to come so late," she said softly. Daniel nodded politely. "It's all right." Her eyes drifted toward the sleeping baby in his arms. She studied Maya for only a moment, but it was enough to notice the tiny sunken cheeks, the pale skin, and the fragile stillness that no newborn should have. Without asking questions or offering sympathy, Martha quietly said 5 simple words. "Let me feed her." Daniel frowned, unsure he had heard correctly. "What? Let me feed your daughter?" He stared at her in confusion. "I have formula," he replied. She won't take it." "I know. You know. I've watched you every day this week. I've seen you walking outside, trying to comfort her. I know she's hungry." Daniel looked down at Maya, then back at Martha. "I've tried everything. I believe you." Silence settled between them. Then Martha took a slow breath before revealing something Daniel never expected. "My grandson was born 6 months ago." Daniel remembered hearing about that. Martha's daughter had struggled after giving birth, and for a time Martha had helped care for the baby. "I've been nursing him while my daughter recovered," Martha continued. "He has started eating soft foods now, but I still have milk." Daniel's eyes widened. "You mean?" She nodded gently. "If you allow me, I can nurse Maya." The words hung in the air. Daniel had never imagined such a thing. Part of him immediately hesitated. He didn't know what was appropriate anymore. Would it be safe? Would people judge them? Was this something anyone still did? Almost as if she could hear every question racing through his mind, Martha spoke again. Long before bottles and powdered formula, our people survived because mothers helped one another. If a woman became sick or died, another mother stepped forward. A hungry baby was never left alone. Daniel remembered stories his own grandmother had told him as a child. In those days, family wasn't measured only by blood. Entire communities shared the responsibility of raising children. But those traditions had slowly faded. Now, standing on his porch, one of those traditions had returned. "I'm afraid," Daniel admitted quietly. "So am I," Martha replied. "But I'm more afraid of what happens if we do nothing." Daniel looked down at Maya. The tiny girl didn't even have the strength to cry anymore. Her breathing was shallow. Her little fingers barely moved. The memory of the nurse's warning echoed in his mind. If she continues refusing food, bring her back immediately. He felt tears burning his eyes again. "I don't want to lose her," he whispered. "You won't be facing this alone." Martha's voice was calm, steady, and full of compassion. For the first time since Lena died, someone wasn't trying to comfort Daniel with promises that everything would be fine. Instead, they were offering to stand beside him. Slowly, Daniel stepped aside from the doorway. "Please," he said. "Come in." Martha entered quietly, removing her shoes before walking into the small living room. She noticed Lena's unfinished baby blanket folded neatly on the couch. A framed wedding photograph rested on the fireplace mantel. Fresh flowers from the funeral still stood in a vase beside it. Nothing had been moved. The grief filled every corner of the house. Without saying a word, Martha sat gently in the old rocking chair that Lena had picked out months before Maya was born. She wrapped a clean blanket around herself and held out her arms. "May I?" Daniel hesitated only a second before carefully placing Maya into them. The elderly woman cradled the baby with practiced tenderness, humming an old Apache lullaby so softly it was almost carried away by the wind outside. The melody was ancient, passed from mothers to daughters for generations. Within moments, Maya began searching instinctively. Then, for the first time since leaving the hospital, she latched on and began to drink. Daniel froze. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The weak, exhausted infant who had refused every bottle now drank eagerly, her tiny hands curling gently against Martha's shawl. Minute after minute passed. The room remained completely silent except for the quiet rhythm of Maya feeding. Then something happened that Daniel hadn't witnessed in days. His daughter relaxed. The tension disappeared from her tiny face. Her breathing became slow and peaceful. When she had finished, Maya let out the smallest contented sigh before drifting into a deep, comfortable sleep. Daniel covered his mouth with both hands as tears streamed down his face. For the first time since Lena's death, they were not tears of despair. They were tears of hope. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen window, warming the small adobe home. For the first time in nearly a week, the silence inside the house did not feel frightening. Maya was sleeping peacefully in her cradle. Daniel stood beside her, hardly believing the change. Her tiny face looked more relaxed than it had since the day she was born. Though she was still fragile, the desperate cries of hunger had been replaced by the quiet breathing of a baby finally able to rest. When Martha had left the night before, she had gently placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I'll come back in the morning," she had said. True to her word, there was another soft knock at the door shortly after sunrise. Daniel opened it with a grateful smile. "Good morning, Martha." She returned the smile. "And how is our little one today?" Daniel paused for a moment. Our little one. The word surprised him. Instead of feeling offended, he found comfort in them. For days, he had carried the burden of parenthood completely alone. Hearing someone share that responsibility, even in such a small way, lightened the weight on his heart. "She slept almost 4 hours," he said. "That's the longest she's slept since we came home." Martha nodded. Her body is finally beginning to trust that food will come. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink before gently lifting Maya into her arms. Again, the baby eagerly accepted her milk. This time, there was no hesitation at all. Daniel watched closely. "You make it look so easy." Martha smiled softly. "It isn't easy. It's love. Babies know the difference." Those words stayed with Daniel long after the feeding was finished. Over the following days, a gentle routine began to take shape. Every morning, Martha walked to Daniel's house carrying a small woven basket. Sometimes it held fresh tortillas. Other times it contained soup, roasted squash, or herbal tea made from desert plants she had gathered herself. She never arrived empty-handed. After feeding Maya, she would stay for an hour or two, quietly helping around the house. She washed dishes without being asked. She folded baby clothes Lena had sewn before her death. She swept the dusty floor while humming old Apache songs. She never acted like a guest. She simply became part of the home. At first, Daniel felt uncomfortable accepting so much help. "You don't have to keep doing all this," he said one afternoon. Martha looked up from the laundry she was folding. "I know. You have your own life." "I do." "Then why?" She smiled gently. "Because some days someone helped me when I needed it." Daniel didn't ask any more questions. One afternoon, while Maya slept between feedings, Martha noticed Daniel staring at a framed photograph of Lena. "Tell me about her," she said. For a long moment, he remained silent. Until then, everyone had spoken about Lena, offering condolences, recalling memories, or expressing sympathy. No one had simply invited him to talk about the woman he loved. Daniel picked up the photograph. "She laughed at everything," he said, smiling through tears. "Even my terrible jokes." "What else?" "She loved watching thunderstorms from the porch." Martha nodded. "And?" "She wanted Maya to grow up knowing every Apache story her grandfather used to tell." As Daniel continued speaking, memories that had once brought only pain slowly became treasures worth sharing. He talked about the day he met Lena at a tribal gathering. Their first dance. Their wedding beneath the cottonwood trees. The excitement they felt decorating the nursery together. The tiny moccasins Lena had made by hand before Maya was born. When he finished, Martha quietly said, "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She was. And she still is. Daniel looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Love doesn't disappear because someone dies. It changes its place. Now it lives in memory, and in this little girl." She gently touched Maya's tiny hand. "Every time she smiles, every story you tell, every lesson you pass on, your wife is still part of this family." Daniel lowered his head. No one had explained grief that way before. Later that week, Martha began teaching Daniel practical skills Lena had never had the chance to share. She showed him how to wrap Maya securely in a cradle blanket. She demonstrated how to soothe her when she became fussy. She explained how to recognize the difference between a hungry cry, a tired cry, and a cry of discomfort. "Babies have their own language," she said. "You only have to learn to listen." Little by little, Daniel's confidence grew. He no longer panicked every time Maya whimpered. He learned to hold her with steady hands instead of trembling ones. He even found himself singing softly to her, something he had been too heartbroken to do since Lena's death. Outside, word quietly spread across the reservation. Neighbors noticed that Maya looked healthier each day. Her cheeks were beginning to fill out. Her tiny eyes stayed open longer. She had even started making small cooing sounds instead of weak cries. People smiled whenever they saw Martha walking toward Daniel's house with her basket. No announcements were made. No one sought recognition. The community simply understood that one of their own had stepped forward when a family needed help. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Daniel sat on the porch holding Maya while Martha prepared to walk home. He looked down at his daughter, who was sleeping peacefully against his chest. Then he turned to the elderly woman. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Martha paused at the gate and smiled. "You don't?" Daniel frowned. "I don't." She shook her head. "No. One day, someone else will need kindness. When that day comes, you'll know exactly what to do." As she disappeared down the dusty path, Daniel realized that Martha had given him far more than help. She had reminded him that even after the deepest loss, healing often begins with a single act of compassion, and grows stronger when it is shared. By the second week, Maya's transformation was becoming impossible to ignore. The tiny baby who had once lain motionless in Daniel's arms now greeted each morning with bright, curious eyes. Her cheeks were beginning to round out, and she no longer cried from constant hunger. Sometimes, while Daniel changed her blanket, she would curl her tiny fingers around his thumb with surprising strength. Each small improvement felt like a miracle. Yet Daniel noticed something else. Whenever Martha thought no one was watching, she would quietly gaze at Maya with a mixture of joy and sadness. There was a tenderness in her eyes that seemed deeper than simple kindness, as though every smile from the baby awakened an old memory. One afternoon, after Maya had fallen asleep, Daniel brewed 2 cups of herbal tea and invited Martha to sit with him on the porch. The desert breeze carried the scent of sage across the hills, and the distant sound of children playing echoed through the reservation. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "There's something I've been wondering." Martha looked at him with a gentle smile. "I thought there might be. You care for Maya as if she's part of your own family." She nodded. "In many ways, she is." Daniel hesitated. "But why?" Martha wrapped both hands around her warm cup before answering. "Because once I had a little girl of my own." Daniel had never heard anyone mention a daughter. He waited quietly. "She was born many years ago," Martha continued. "Her name was Lily." A soft smile crossed her face. "She had your daughter's dark eyes." "What happened?" The smile slowly faded. "When she was only 8 months old, a sickness spread through our community." Daniel lowered his eyes. Years ago, access to medical care on the reservation had been limited. Older residents often spoke about illnesses that modern medicine could easily treat today but had once claimed many lives. "We did everything we could," Martha whispered. "The medicine wasn't enough." "No. And I lost her." The words were spoken calmly, but Daniel could hear the sorrow hidden beneath them. "It has been over 40 years, she continued. "People think grief disappears with time." She gently shook her head. "It doesn't. It changes." Daniel nodded slowly. "I know what you mean. There are days when it becomes easier to carry." She looked toward the mountains. "And there are days when it feels just as heavy as the morning you first wake up without the person you love." For several moments, they simply listened to the wind. Finally, Martha reached into the pocket of her shawl and removed a small, faded photograph. The edges were worn from years of being handled. She handed it to Daniel. It showed a young woman holding a laughing baby wrapped in a handmade blanket. "You." She smiled. "I was 22. And Lily. My whole world." Daniel carefully returned the photograph. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you." She tucked it safely back into her pocket. "When Lena died," Martha continued softly, "I saw something familiar in your eyes." "My fear?" "No." She looked directly at him. "Your loneliness." Daniel swallowed hard. "I remember sitting alone after Lily died, believing no one could possibly understand what I was feeling. She paused. I was wrong. Who helped you? My grandmother. Daniel smiled faintly. She reminded me that Apache families have never survived by standing alone. Martha's eyes brightened as she continued. Our ancestors believed every child belonged to the community. If one mother couldn't care for her baby, another stepped in. If one father was grieving, neighbors carried part of his burden. Not because they were asked. Because that's what family meant. Daniel looked around the reservation. The homes were simple. The roads were dusty. Many families struggled financially. Yet despite having so little, people always seemed willing to share whatever they had. I've been so focused on doing everything myself, he admitted. I thought asking for help meant I was failing Maya. Martha gently shook her head. No. She leaned forward. It means you love her enough to do whatever keeps her alive. Those words settled deeply into Daniel's heart. That evening, Martha invited him and Maya to a small gathering beneath the old cottonwood tree near the community center. Several tribal elders had heard about Maya's recovery and wished to offer a traditional blessing for the child. As the sun dipped below the mountains, families gathered in a quiet circle. Children sat beside their grandparents. Parents held sleeping babies close. The oldest elder, his silver hair tied neatly behind his shoulders, stepped forward with a carved eagle feather. He spoke first in Apache, then repeated his words in English so everyone could understand. A child who survives because of love carries the strength of many hearts. He gently brushed the feather above Maya's forehead. May she grow with courage. Above her hands. May she give more kindness than she receives. Above her tiny feet. May every step she takes honor those who walked before her. Daniel felt tears filling his eyes again. This time they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude. As the blessing ended, neighbors approached one by one. Some brought handmade blankets. Others offered baby clothes their own children had outgrown. One family gifted a beautifully carved wooden cradleboard. Another promised to help Daniel repair his aging roof before winter. No one expected anything in return. They simply gave. Looking around the circle, Daniel realized he had misunderstood strength all along. Strength was not carrying every burden by yourself. Strength was trusting others enough to let them help carry it with you. That night, after everyone had gone home, Daniel tucked Maya into her cradle. She smiled in her sleep. For the first time since Lena's passing, he looked toward the stars above the reservation and whispered words that no longer came from despair. Thank you. And somewhere deep within his heart, he felt certain that Lena would have been smiling too. Summer slowly gave way to autumn, and the Apache reservation began to change with the season. Cottonwood leaves turned brilliant shades of yellow, and the cool evening breeze carried the earthy scent of rain across the desert. Life moved at its familiar pace, but for Daniel and Maya, everything felt different. The little girl who had once struggled to survive was now thriving. At 4 months old, Maya had become the brightest light in Daniel's life. Every morning she greeted him with a wide smile that erased a little more of the sadness he had carried since Lena's death. Her laughter echoed through the small adobe house, filling the empty rooms with a joy Daniel had feared he would never hear again. She had grown stronger with each passing week. Her tiny legs kicked excitedly whenever she saw Martha arrive, and her bright brown eyes followed the elderly woman around the room with unmistakable affection. Martha laughed whenever she noticed. I think she's already learned to recognize my footsteps. Daniel smiled. I think she has. Although Maya had begun eating soft foods, Martha continued visiting almost every day. Their time together was no longer only about feeding the baby. She had become part of their family in every way that mattered. Sometimes she read old Apache legends while rocking Maya to sleep. Other days she taught Daniel traditional lullabies that Lena had wanted their daughter to know. Together they filled Maya's childhood with stories of courage, respect, and compassion, values that had shaped their people for generations. As Maya grew healthier, Daniel found himself stepping back into the community he had withdrawn from after Lena's death. At first, it was small things. He helped repair the fence around the community garden. He volunteered to carry supplies during tribal gatherings. He offered rides to elders who needed transportation to the health clinic. The simple acts reminded him that he still had something valuable to give. One Saturday morning, while working alongside several neighbors repairing a playground, Daniel overheard two young fathers discussing the challenges of raising children. One man admitted he had recently lost his job. Another confessed he often felt overwhelmed trying to provide for his growing family. Their conversation sounded painfully familiar. Daniel realized that grief wasn't the only burden people carried in silence. Many families struggled without asking for help because they feared appearing weak. That evening he shared his thoughts with Martha. "I've been thinking," he said as they sat on the porch watching Maya crawl across a blanket. She looked up. "About what?" "When Lena died, everyone wanted to help me. They did. But I kept pushing them away." Martha nodded gently. "You believed you had to survive alone. I don't want anyone else to feel that way." She smiled, sensing where his thoughts were leading. "What do you have in mind?" Daniel leaned forward. "What if we organized something? For young parents. For widows. For grandparents raising grandchildren. A place where people could share meals, baby supplies, advice, whatever they needed." Martha's eyes brightened. "That sounds like the old days." "The old days?" She nodded. "When I was a little girl, no family ever faced hardship alone. If one home had extra food, it was shared. If one mother became ill, another cared for her children. If one father lost hope, the community reminded him he wasn't alone." Daniel smiled. "Maybe it's time we remembered." The idea spread quickly throughout the reservation. Within weeks, families began donating baby clothes, blankets, diapers, and children's books they no longer needed. The tribal community center opened one room as a gathering place where parents could meet every Thursday evening. Experienced grandparents volunteered to mentor young mothers and fathers. Local nurses occasionally stopped by to answer questions about infant care. Even teenagers helped by entertaining younger children while exhausted parents enjoyed a few moments of rest. No one called it a charity. It wasn't. It was simply neighbors caring for neighbors. The greatest surprise came from the children themselves. Watching their parents help others inspired them to do the same. Some organized food drives for elders. Others collected school supplies for younger students. One little boy proudly donated his favorite stuffed bear after hearing that another child had lost everything in a house fire. Acts of kindness began multiplying throughout the community. People often traced the beginning back to one simple moment. The night an elderly woman had knocked on a grieving father's door. Months passed, and soon it was time for Maya's first birthday. Daniel wanted to keep the celebration small. But the community had other plans. When he arrived at the gathering hall carrying Maya, he stopped in amazement. Nearly everyone on the reservation had come. Long tables overflowed with homemade food. Children played beneath colorful ribbons tied between the cottonwood trees. Musicians performed traditional Apache songs while families laughed together. Near the center of the room stood a large birthday cake decorated with tiny wildflowers. Daniel looked at Martha in disbelief. "You knew about this?" She smiled innocently. "I may have heard a rumor." As the celebration began, one of the tribal elders stepped forward and gently tapped his walking stick against the ground. "I believe someone has a few words to share." The crowd turned toward Daniel. His heart raced. Public speaking had never come easily. But looking around the room, he saw the faces of people who had carried him through the darkest season of his life. Taking a deep breath, he lifted Maya into his arms. "A year ago," he began, "I believed I had lost everything." The room fell silent. "I buried my wife. I thought I was about to lose my daughter. There were days I didn't think I could survive. His voice cracked. But then someone knocked on my door. He looked at Martha. She didn't bring answers. She brought love. Daniel paused, struggling to hold back tears. My daughter is alive because one person chose compassion over comfort. He slowly turned toward the crowd. And she's thriving because every one of you reminded me that family is something we build together. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then the room filled with applause, not for Daniel, but for the spirit of unity that had transformed their community. As Martha wiped a quiet tear from her cheek, Maya reached out her tiny arms toward her with a joyful laugh. The elderly woman smiled and embraced the little girl she had helped save. In that moment, everyone present understood that the strongest families are not always connected by blood. Sometimes, they are connected by kindness. 20 years passed more quickly than anyone expected. The little adobe house that had once been filled with grief now echoed with laughter, music, and stories. The cottonwood tree in the front yard had grown tall, casting cool shade across the porch where Daniel often sat in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the Apache reservation in warm shades of orange and gold. Life had changed in beautiful ways. Daniel's hair had begun to gray around the temples, and the lines on his face spoke of years spent working hard and loving deeply. Though he still missed Lena every single day, the sharp pain of losing her had softened into a quiet gratitude for the years they had shared. He had kept every promise he made to her. Their daughter, Maya, had grown into a remarkable young woman. She inherited her mother's gentle smile and compassionate heart, along with her father's quiet determination. From an early age, Maya was known throughout the reservation as someone who never ignored a person in need. She volunteered at the community center, helped elders with groceries, tutored younger children after school, and organized seasonal food drives for struggling families. People often said she had a gift for making others feel seen. Daniel knew exactly where that gift had come from. Martha. Now well into her 80s, Martha walked a little slower than she once had. Her silver hair had become completely white, and she leaned on a beautifully carved wooden cane made for her by one of the tribal craftsmen. Yet her eyes still carried the same warmth they had on the night she first knocked on Daniel's door. To Maya, she had never simply been a neighbor. She was Grandma Martha. Or, as Maya lovingly called her, my milk mother. The name had begun when Maya was a little girl after Daniel gently explained how Martha had saved her life. From that day forward, Maya never celebrated a birthday without making sure Martha was sitting beside her. Every Mother's Day, she brought Martha wildflowers gathered from the hills. Every Thanksgiving, the first slice of pie went onto Martha's plate. And every important milestone in Maya's life included the woman who had nourished her when no one else could. One crisp autumn afternoon, the reservation gathered once again beneath the old cottonwood tree for the annual Family Heritage Festival. The celebration had become one of the community's most cherished traditions, bringing together elders, children, and young families to share stories, songs, and meals. This year's festival carried special meaning. Maya had been invited to deliver the keynote address. Standing before friends, neighbors, and visitors, she smiled as she looked out at the crowd. Many faces had changed over the years. Some of the elders who had blessed her as a baby were no longer there. A new generation of children now played beneath the same tree. But the spirit of the community remained unchanged. Maya took a deep breath. When people ask me who my family is, she began, I tell them I was raised by 3 extraordinary people. She paused and looked toward Daniel. My father taught me courage. Then she turned toward a framed photograph of Lena displayed beside the stage. My mother gave me life, even though I never had the chance to know her. Finally, her eyes rested on Martha, seated in the front row. And my milk mother taught me that love doesn't depend on biology. The audience grew silent. I wouldn't be standing here today if she hadn't knocked on our door 20 years ago. Martha lowered her head, embarrassed by the attention. Maya smiled. She has always said she didn't save me alone. She said an entire community did. I believe she was right. She looked around at the families gathered together. Our people have always understood something the world sometimes forgets. We are strongest when we care for one another. When one person suffers, we all feel the pain. When one child succeeds, we all celebrate. When one family falls, we help them stand again. The applause that followed echoed across the valley. After the ceremony, children gathered around Martha, asking her to tell one of her famous stories. She laughed softly and welcomed them onto the blanket spread beneath the cottonwood tree. Daniel watched from a distance, his heart overflowing with gratitude. Years ago, he had believed the knock on his door had saved only Maya. Now he understood it had saved him as well. It had rescued him from loneliness. It had restored his faith in community. It had reminded him that accepting help is not a sign of weakness but an act of trust. As the sun began to set, Maya sat beside Martha, gently taking the elderly woman's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Martha smiled. "For what?" "For giving me the chance to grow up." The older woman squeezed her hand. "You've given me just as much." That evening, as families headed home, Daniel paused beneath the cottonwood tree and looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. He thought of Lena. He imagined her watching over them with the same loving smile he remembered from so many years before. Quietly, he spoke into the evening air. "You were right. Our daughter is strong." The breeze rustled through the branches above him, carrying with it the laughter of children and the voices of neighbors saying their goodbyes. It sounded like hope. It sounded like home. And it all began with one gentle knock on a grieving father's door, and 5 unforgettable words. "Let me feed her."